Hello, today is Friday, June 26th, and I'm David Barker of Creatus Media, and I'm with Dr. Shana for Ask Dr. Shana. Shana, what are we going to talk about today?
Well, last week, having done an episode on civilian post-traumatic stress disorder, I feel I should do one on military post-traumatic stress disorder because of the very sad numbers that we have, and I'm not going to review them here, about the number of young service people who return from one of our overseas wars and at some point feel suicidal. But first, I feel I owe an apology to at least some of my viewers, and so I'm going to deliver that.
Okay.
Last week, I said that my new website, which is drshana.com, by putting in a second H, I'm hoping people will read it as Dr. Shana and not Dr. Shana or Dr. Shana to rhyme with Hannah. The actual spelling of my name does not have two H's in it, but I put it in the name of the website so that people would hopefully say it right. And I said it would be up by this Wednesday, but we aren't quite finished with it yet. So it'll be up soon, and I'm not going to be such a fool as to mention another date in particular. But the reason that I'm mentioning it is that I would love to hear, or that is to get an email from some of you. I also put my phone number on there, and I said, call me between 4:30 and 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time, because I'm in the state of New York, and I'd love to talk to you. It's rather lonely for me to keep making episodes and not know who's listening, or is there, most importantly for me, is there something that I have never discussed or that you've never heard about that you would like me to discuss? Now, the previous people that were helping me before Mr. Barker with the recording of episodes, I asked them to know who had sent me any emails, and at first they were just going to give me email addresses without the message that was part of the thing, and I said, no, that's crazy. I have to be able to respond to the person according to what they said. And so they sent me the contents of the emails, but with no way to reply to them. I will mention that there was one person who wrote that she had purchased Taming the Dragon, which is a book about everything you need to know if you or a family member falls mentally ill. And she found it practical, useful, and even helpful for her own personal situation. I would have loved to talk to that lady, and I would like to thank those few of you who have sent me encouragement from time to time, because it's a strange feeling sending out a recording into the ether, and you never know who listens, you never know what they think, you never know if you said something well or did you say it badly, or maybe there's a whole different subject that they wish you would talk about. So the most interesting part of the website for me will be the contact us, which I will look at frequently.
And this is all about building community and talking with each other. And this is a work in progress, and we're very excited about getting this launched. And you can go see, there's some pages up now, but as the week goes on, it's just going to get more and more developed and filled out. And we're just looking so much to hearing from all of our viewers.
Yes, exactly. Now, as to combat PTSD, well, first of all, I will make the statement I made last week that it isn't called post-traumatic stress disorder until the symptoms have persisted for more than 30 days after the identified trauma. Now, and it gets a little more complicated when a person gets repeated trauma as they would in a war zone, because you don't have just one painful and unfortunate happening one day and then that's it for the rest of your life. It goes on and on and on until you get the opportunity to leave the war zone. But post-traumatic stress disorder assumes that you have had a trauma in which you were either directly under threat of death or dismemberment, which I would freely grant to anybody in a war zone, or you were a direct witness to somebody else's threat or event of death or dismemberment, which again, in a war zone, that's going to be a fairly frequent occurrence. One of the most afflicted groups from World War II, interestingly, were the women who were in a room who were in contact with the Royal Air Force pilots when they went on their mission to go into Germany and bomb the enemy. This was because over a period of time, the young women got to know the pilots and they had a certain camaraderie with them. And then to hear the pilot say, "I'm hit," and hear the plane crash was very traumatizing for these young women, particularly since they were in contact with several pilots and they couldn't go and relax for a few minutes to get over the death of one of them. They had to still be on duty for the others. And there were, I think it was something over 80% of them got post-traumatic stress disorder.
That's very interesting. I never had heard that. And that's not, you're not even actually there. It's kind of a virtual experience.
Well, yes, except that they knew the pilots well, and they were certainly a witness to the plane crashes.
Mm-hmm.
Not a visual witness, but an auditory witness.
Yeah.
So, now the symptoms are PTSD is an anxiety disorder, and the symptoms can be nightmares, flashbacks. A flashback is a delusion, a false understanding that the person who is out of the war zone and perhaps back in the States is suddenly back in the war zone, and for those moments of the flashback, they really feel they are back in the war zone.
They're actually reliving that whole experience. It's like they're right there.
Yes. And usually it's people around them that will say, no, no, you're here with us. You're in Oklahoma. You're not in the war zone anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And manage to disconnect the person from the flashback. Needless to say, sleep under such circumstances can be very difficult because a person wakes up from a nightmare of a real event that they experienced and they're in a flashback. Waking up does not have the salutary realization, hey, the nightmare is not real, that it does for most of us. Now, most episodes that I record are based on disseminating information and giving the person who has the problem some suggestions as to what they can do for themselves. I would say that the VA has some excellent groups and get-togethers for anybody who's a combat vet. And the VA has a nationwide suicide hotline for anybody who is suicidal to call and talk to a living person, a real person who's there. And I would recommend these. They're really, much as we may think of the VA as not very good on certain things, they're really good at this. So much so that, for instance, in Rochester, they give out the VA's phone number for anybody who's suicidal, vet or not. Unfortunately, I don't have the phone number memorized. But if you call any VA and ask for what the suicide number is, it's very easy to obtain.
So, what are these things that you suggest that combat vets can do for themselves to, I mean, they're going to hopefully be seeing a psychiatrist or some kind of therapist, but what are the things that they can do in the meantime?
That's what I was about to get to. For one thing, when you have a distressing thought, think about, where am I right now? If I'm home in my living room, I'm not in a war zone, and so that noise that I heard is not enemy incoming fire. It was perhaps a car that backfired. Or there may be an accident, but an accident isn't always fatal. And since I'm here in my living room, nobody is trying to kill me. And if you look out the window and see an accident, then maybe you can call 911 and just say, there is a 2-car, 3-car, whatever accident on the corner of such and such and so, please go there. But the most important thing is, where am I? And is anyone trying to get me right now? I'm dismayed when I think about the idea that we seem to have some trigger-happy members of law enforcement in this country, and so it's not as safe as it once was. There is some legislation that has passed the House, but probably will not pass the Senate and will be, the president has said, vetoed by him.
And this is banning chokeholds by the police nationally, as I recall.
That's one of the things. It's also mandating retraining.
Oh,
I think they could have done something very simple, like say that a returning veteran from a foreign war who has been told many times over to always use maximum force should not be permitted to join any law enforcement for a few years. And I don't know if there's any research as to how long that need be, until he gets the use maximum force mentality out of his head.
a lot of these police who are hired as vets who have recently been discharged, a lot of them do have PTSD. Is that an accurate statement?
I don't think anybody who has full-blown PTSD could hold any kind of job, because they wouldn't be able to get to work on time. They'd become very frightened over nothing that anybody else could understand. But apparently I remember I said in the beginning that only about 25% of the returning military complain of PTSD. Now, maybe that's underreported, probably is. Maybe it's 50% if everybody were truthful. But still, there's 50% that do not have it. Some people are able to focus on My job is to shoot the enemy and preserve myself, and they don't pay attention, really. I mean, they may see it, but it just doesn't traumatize them to the same extent. But the main thing I would say also is to keep busy with something. If somebody returns with, let's say, a modest case of PTSD, if they sit idle for quite a while, they may start to think about recent events in their lives. And just as if you sit on your living room couch and think things over, you may think about what happened last Saturday. Well, if last Saturday you were in Afghanistan, you want to stay away, so that, I'm not trying to say that people have to forget it. That's unrealistic. But the past can become the past. And perhaps there were some unfortunate things that happened to a person when they were a child. But as they grow up and have a grown-up life, that can slide into the past.
Mm-hmm.
They still remember it, but it doesn't govern their thinking.
Mm-hmm. It's sort of about being in the here and now, and not dwelling in the past, and not anticipating the future. It's that just trying to focus on what is happening right here, right now. And for some people, that's really difficult to do, obviously, with PTSD. And these are some great suggestions.
Well, and it's also a good idea to have somebody you like who's around, because if you take off into a flashback, that person can say, "Hey, Joe, you're not in Kandahar right now.
Mm-hmm.
You're back in Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm.
Come on," and don't slip into the thing of, well, a lot of people don't understand me, so I'm going to become a recluse. For that, the VA's groups and not just talk groups about trauma, veterans say that another veteran is very easy to talk to, because they're not going to talk about being in combat, but there's just a feeling that the other guy understands what's going through their mind, and the other guy does not freak out if they trip into a flashback.
Mm-hmm.
They just put their arms around him and say, "Come on, Joe, we're going to play basketball," or whatever is the thing of the moment. And it has also been found that the old-fashioned way of doing war, which is that our guys have a big camp here, and inside the camp you feel pretty safe, and the enemy has a big camp a few miles over there, and every once in a while people leave their camps and confront each other, and that's where the war happens. But this business of guerrilla warfare, no big organized army with a good supply chain and so on is going to do well in guerrilla warfare, because it depends on knowing the local terrain intimately, and it depends on, for instance, knowing how to walk through the jungle soundlessly, which we as Americans don't know how to do. And so the numbers with PTSD from one of our recent wars, Vietnam and Afghanistan, do not, those people with PTSD have a much harder case than people from World War II. Also important, in World War II, the U.S. forces were welcomed home as heroes because we had defeated two very evil things. Hitler, who was trying to eliminate an entire human race by putting them in gas chambers, and the Japanese, who came in the wee hours of December 7th, 41, and sank a number of ships of our fleet with all the sailors asleep. And now that is a direct attack, so there was no question we had to go to war over that one. The reasons for more recent wars may be understood by high-placed politicos, but the man in the street doesn't really know why, or doesn't really know what it's all about, or why should he suddenly shoot up people or get the village population in the church and then burn down the church. And the line between well-executed campaign and a war crime can become blurred, and it's all very confusing. But the main thing for the veterans who are lucky enough to get home to do is stick with the present. As Mr. Barker said, stick with the here and now. Many of them will be looking for jobs, or possibly looking for a junior college course in something, so that they will have, shall we say, a certificate as a carpenter or an electrician or something. Or perhaps they did have some job experience before they went overseas, and they want to get updated in their field. But the thing is, there are things that the veterans should be doing. And certainly isolating themselves because in their town they don't happen to know another vet. Call the VA. And now, in case anybody, I don't suppose anybody needs this, but beyond the nightmares and the flashbacks, there can be extreme nervousness in situations. I mean, somebody can be sitting in their own living room and shaking.
Mm-hmm.
And I was the psychiatrist for all returning vets to Fort Drum, which is in upstate New York, and our unit would hospitalize people if they were really in a bad way. And the main thing is stick with the here and now.
Mm-hmm.
Your war experience is over with. Now, this is complicated by the fact that these days we have an all-volunteer army, and we perhaps don't have the numbers we would like to have. So somebody can be given home leave and then 24 hours later be called back. But once you are well and truly discharged, and I would recommend what we had in the Vietnam era, which was a draft army, the standard service was 1 year. There were some people who went in for 2 or 3 years, but I wouldn't recommend that for anybody. And I saw a man who was a captain who came back to Fort Drum, and I said to him, you know, he was starting to have the symptoms of PTSD, and I said, if you go back into the war zone, it'll just get to be much worse and much more difficult to get out of. So he took my advice and called his dad, who was in Arizona, and they put an article in the local paper saying that he should not be pressured to re-enlist.
Mm-hmm.
And he said he wasn't going back. And I said, well, that's a prudent man. I mean, you've done your bit.
Mm-hmm.
So let somebody else take the rough stuff now.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I have encountered people who feel guilty because, for example, in Vietnam, they would make a 5-year-old carry a hand grenade right up to us, the enemy, and so our soldiers got rather suspicious of seeing a small child on the battlefield, and sometimes the so-called hand grenade was actually the kid's teddy bear, and so they felt very guilty. And I suggested there is an international charity, if you like, which exists that takes out unexploded ordnance from everywhere all over the world, because there's even unexploded ordnance under the ground in France, for example, from World War I. This because we have large numbers of small children who will step on something and blow their leg off.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're trying to get to it, and I suggested it costs something like $20 to join this. And I said, so you get together with 3 buddies, and each of you can afford $5, and so you contribute to saving the lives of small children.
Mm-hmm.
People do things in war that they never imagined that they would or could. And I think it is not a good idea for people to feel guilty for having followed an order when our young men and women are not trained as to evaluating the order and deciding, well, this is legitimate wartime activity and this is a war crime. Frankly, I wish that we could elect some presidents who are most reluctant to send our young people, men and women, into somebody else's war.
Mm-hmm.
I know that a lot of the wars are fought for reasons of geopolitics or whatever, but I think we should confine our shooting wars to direct attacks on the United States, such as at Pearl Harbor, or to getting rid of a despot who wants to send millions of people to the gas chamber, as in Hitler. I don't think there was anything other than an all-out shooting war that would have defeated him. So,
Well, this has been fascinating. We've got some really good tips. And is there any last thoughts?
yes, I encountered one veteran who came in with a notebook full of pictures of his dead and dying comrades, meaning in the act of dying, not pictures from their high school yearbook and then they died so many years later. And I told him that he needs to know exactly where that book is. And I said, put it in the attic, in the garage, in the basement, and I want you to know exactly where it is. And I turned to his wife who was with him and I said, if you ever move it, you have to tell him it's been moved. And I said, keep it because it's an important part of your life and maybe one day your son would like to see it. And maybe that would not make him so keen to voluntarily join one of the armed forces because he'd see something of what one sees in a war. But for heaven's sakes, from now on, don't you look at it. Let it recede in your memory as your childhood has receded, as your high school days have receded. Let it just become something that happened, and I never ask people to forget things, but just don't make it part of your present. It is very useful to be able to be, as we say, present to the present, because many people are not. Many people, for instance, are so focused on trying to do a business deal that they don't make it to their kids' graduation, or they make it to the kids' graduation and they go through the motions, but they don't take it in emotionally. So, life is to be lived and life is to be enjoyed as much as possible, and choose something to make a living that will also do somebody some good. I mean, if you're a good and honest mechanic, you take someone who brings you a car that's just not working right, and for a reasonable sum of money, you give them back a car that runs and everything goes. So you did them some good. and gently say to teenagers or young adults that participating in the armed services is not all beer and Skittles. There's some distinct drawbacks, such as you might get killed. And even if you don't get killed, the things you see and the things you're part of will probably stay with you for the rest of your life. But they stay with you, but they're in the back of your mind somewhere. In the forefront of your mind is whatever you're doing in the present. But I just wish some returning vets could talk to young people and say, you know, we have parades and we have music and it looks terrific, but when you get over and you realize that all those people are trying to kill you, it's not that terrific. Seems to me a returning vet should be the greatest antidote to recruiting posters. Now, since the end of World War II and the GI Bill, some guys go over, do a stint in the war, and come back and get their education paid for, and that's certainly a worthwhile go. Of course, they take a tremendous risk because they might come home, so to speak, in a pine box. And while we're at it, I'm going to say something else on another subject. Coronavirus is a killer. There have been upwards of 124,000 deaths so far, and they're still going up. And it seems that we can't get together as a country and agree that whenever we're out in public, we will be wearing a face mask, and that we will sit 6 feet away from the next person, and that this is for the public good, because I, for one, don't want to see 200,000 dead due to coronavirus, because people can't subordinate their wishes enough to put on a face mask when they go out. Putting on a face mask is not painful, it's not particularly expensive, and it's a small... We in New York say that wearing your face mask is a sign of the respect of the life of other people. And because we don't want to identify ourselves as people who don't give a hoot for the next guy, we put on our face masks. Because, truth to tell, the public health community, I do have a doctorate in public health, and when I was getting my doctorate in the early 90s, they said that we should expect a series of pandemics of different bugs in the 21st century. So some of this may have to become a way of life for some of us, at least putting the face mask on. And contrary to what one person in Miami said, face masks, a little piece of paper in front of your nose and mouth, do not kill people. I don't know where she got that idea, but they don't. So let's enjoy the rest of the summer. I don't know whether we're going to have public fireworks on July 4th, because at least in New York, we're trying not to have large gatherings of many people who may get too close together. But let's enjoy it as much as we can. Let's enjoy. We're having rather nice weather, so let's enjoy that. And if anybody would like me to talk to another subject, I believe the comments page is already up. Is that correct, Mr. Barker?
Yes.
So if you go to drshahna.com and click on comments, which I think is the first one over on the top left, and leave your comment. I will look at those very carefully, and I thank all those that have already sent me words of encouragement that I could not acknowledge because I wasn't supplied with the email address to send the reply to. But thank you so much, because I've done a little bit of acting in my life, but you have the audience is in front of you, and you can tell if they like what you said, or if they found it funny, or if they didn't like it, but at least you get a reaction. And this internet system, you don't. So, okay, until next week, and I do hope somebody will post some comment or something on my website, particularly if there's a topic that you would like me to cover. In the first series that was run by the previous publisher, I had gone over all the major psychiatric diagnoses. By the way, I did say last week, but I'll say it again and finish on that. The natural history, that is, if someone has an illness and it's not treated and nothing is done, but the natural history of post-traumatic stress disorder is to attenuate, that is, the symptoms gradually disappear with time. The only thing is, most people go to a practitioner because they don't want to wait years for the symptoms to go away. But at least I can tell you with assurance that it doesn't get worse with time. Okay, until next week then.